so much for joining us this morning.
Yeah, Aubrey, thank you very much for having me. And everyone, I do apologize. I am actually on my iPad. I woke up this morning. I just told him that I woke up this morning to a blue screen of death on my desktop. So, you know, as Murphy's Law applies, almost every week in my life, I think, it applied today. So nevertheless, on my iPad, I'm going to be presenting this from here as well. You should still be able to see me and see the presentation, but if there are any issues, please just, Aubrey, ping me and let me know. But without further ado, I will launch this presentation if I can. Present, right? It's a thing. Present, cool. Full screen. All right. And then I will share content. Start broadcast. 2. Perfect. Okay. Can everybody see this?
I can see it. This is perfect.
Perfect. Awesome. Yeah. So as Aubrey mentioned, so my PhD research focuses on particularly international, but more so allied cooperation in space. The title, of course, is Beyond Artemis, a Framework for Strategic International Cooperation in Space Exploration and Security. So I'm currently a PhD student at the University of North Dakota. I'm now just in my dissertation phase, so I'm ABD, and I've been able to start focusing a lot on my research, gathering data and starting that process. And so we'll get a little bit into how I'm structuring that research from the methodology and method standpoint. But first, we're going to go in and look at really what's the catalyst for this research. Why am I doing this? So there was a specific question that I wanted to answer. I didn't necessarily want to get into the deep in the weeds of the why, actually. I wanted to get more so in the weeds to how. So I actually think why is going to be another research question that needs to be answered from a different research project later on, or with some colleagues that I've been discussing with. But really it focuses on how exactly should a organization, a treaty-based system, you can, for the sake of having a analogy to pull from, look at NATO or the European Space Agency, treaty-based systems that have legally binding resolutions and generally require their member states to actually foot over a bill for it, right? How should it be structured legally and organizationally if it is established? Now, there obviously is that other question of, is it needed, right? Or why is it needed? This research is actually treating that as if it's already an answered question. It's treating it as if, yes, it is needed. So if it's needed, this is how it should be structured. The reason we didn't want to get into the why is because when we started to have a lot of those conversations, it actually became, I wouldn't say contentious, but it very quickly, you had a lot of very, very, very intense opinions about this matter. And so we really didn't want to get lost, more so having to handle understanding all of those different opinions and really trying to grab a good answer out of that. We think that it might actually be too premature to answer that. But nevertheless, there's a lot of expectations that we're going towards a direction that there's going to be some kind of formal or legally binding system that's going to come out of this. And then we can go in a little bit more into how it's going to look here throughout this discussion, as well as I'll be able to take some questions here after. So when we talk about a treaty-based system, right, the reason that the title is Beyond Artemis is that Artemis is not a treaty-based system, right? It is a non-binding set of principles that are agreed upon by states that want to establish essentially a baseline, a foundation of what they think norms are, right, in this domain. At the end of the day, right, you don't actually have to adhere to them. Again, they're not legally binding. There are perspectives that, while they aren't legally binding, they are binding in a way of just establishing a norm and establishing a very, very soft law. Nevertheless, the reality, the geopolitical reality, is that people can very well easily violate those and not really have any consequences, right? Because they didn't sign up for any consequences. Beyond that, there are some confusing areas where most of you probably already know. You've probably been paying attention to this issue, right? Where you have a state that can join the Artemis Accords, and then all of a sudden it will go and join the ILRSO, which I'll get into that. That's the International Lunar Research Station Organization, which is actually intended to be a binding treaty-based organization that is founded predominantly by China, but also in part by Russia. So it's a joint partnership. They have not necessarily fully announced the principles publicly. They have been going back and forth on them. And there was an expectation that we would actually have heard something last summer, I believe, but we didn't. And so there are some things that are still up in the air, but nevertheless, I do believe that we'll probably see something here in the coming months to a year. So the problem is once you join that, right, you actually could be in violation of a multitude of policies here in the United States. Particularly under the Wolf Amendment, it prevents the United States from cooperating with China on both scientific, but also a swath of things dealing with anything space technology focused, right? So the problem there, and there's a particular example of this with the United Arab Emirates. They joined Artemis, then they went and joined ILRSO. And actually there was, the State Department had to contact the UAE and say, hey, we just need to make sure that whatever technology we're working with here is protected, right? Because we can't have the UAE essentially serving as a loophole or as a feeder where China could be still gaining some kind of advantage from a partnership with them from our technology. So obviously there's leftover questions, right? The Artemis Accords did not answer those. And in fact, they kind of opened the door potentially to where you could have more of these problems arise. Nevertheless, we have obviously handled those. We've communicated very well with the UAE, and it's very clear, where a lot of these countries want to align. Nevertheless, the Accords still do fall short from that. Now, I don't want to come across as critiquing the Accords. I think I actually am a huge fan of them. I work with a lot of people who helped establish them, and I think that it was a great leap forward, but they also serve a specific purpose, whereas this institution that we're looking at from a research question is actually serving a different one. So they build off of each other. So obviously, as you see here, ILRSO, that's technically supposed to be a design for the International Lunar Research Station there on the bottom. So that's the Chinese and Russian model that they've put out in some of their media. And then you have, of course, ours, which is the Artemis Accords now, which are different from the Artemis program. However, for international states to join the Artemis program, they have to have signed the Artemis Accords. So there is a connection there into our programmatic structure within NASA. And then, of course, you have all these other precedents that have been set. You have more military space forces being organized, not necessarily being created from scratch, but more so being organized. Some have been kind of created from scratch, depending on which state you're looking at. But obviously, with the Chinese, they were technically one of the first to have a more independent military force structure. The PLA, the People's Liberation Army, is not, the way they structure their forces, obviously fairly different from ours. Everything kind of falls under the Army from a party standpoint and from a structure standpoint, but at the end of the day, they still have fair independence amongst themselves with the various services. So the Strategic Support Force was established, and that handles both space, cyber, and psychological operations. Of course, we established the Space Force not too long after, and you have some other countries like Russia that have had independent space forces in the past that are somewhat dependent now on a broader service that have just seen restructurings, right? Nevertheless, there is a multitude of interest on this topic that has increased, and you're seeing a lot more funding going towards it. So a lot of people do ask, well, you know, Eric, if there's people that are still split on this topic of creating some type of treaty-based system, why do it? Well, there's been discussion about it publicly, and there's very clear need when you do talk to a lot of commanders across the Allied forces. You will see that people generally have this expectation that something needs to change, something needs to happen, because the current system is not the most efficient. NATO obviously focuses on the North Atlantic territories and North Atlantic region, right? That is inherently not Japan, South Korea, Australia, even India, right? And so since they are so regionally focused in the world, there needs to be something that is broader, because space is not only global, it's obviously the largest domain there is. And so there needs to be more multilateral cooperation outside of the North Atlantic area. You also have, you know, the Five Eyes and some of these other treaty systems and organizations that, while they are effective at doing a lot of the jobs that they've been tasked with, they've never been tasked with handling cooperation between space commands and space forces in a multitude of ways. And so that's why there's been more discussion of getting us over to something that's a little bit more formalized and obviously focused on space itself. And so there's been a lot of talk. What should it look like? Should it be completely international, right? Here there was a question, and honestly, I can't remember when exactly this was. I think this was a SIND 2022, where General Shaw was actually asked, you know, do we think that there's going to need to be a world space organization, kind of modeled after the World Health Organization? And he predicted there will be a greater need for an internationally agreed upon space governance in the days to come. So the problem with this is that a lot of people are studying and researching and coming to the conclusion that there's kind of writing on the wall, right? The likelihood of all states coming together, right, especially under the United Nations, and having a completely internationally agreed upon added set of norms to the already existing international space law that we see is going to be extremely difficult. I fall into that camp where I am highly skeptical that would even be possible here currently today. It's not that I don't think that will ever be possible, but I definitely don't think it's going to be possible today. So I actually would argue to not, you know, expend much of your time trying to get that done, because it's probably going to fall on a lot of deaf ears. That being said, this statement does acknowledge that there needs to be more internationally agreed upon space governance, right? Does that mean that it's going to be agreed upon by the entire globe? Probably not, right? But it does note that there's some gaps, right? And we're going to need to fill those gaps, and that could go for a multitude of things. Whether it's you know, sustainability in space, particularly focused on space debris mitigation, and also just you know, maintaining open lanes of commerce. That goes for low Earth orbit all the way out to cislunar and beyond, of course, when we kind of go into some of those topics about open lanes of commerce. But you obviously see a lot of synergies and similarities with what you will see me and others talk about, how the Navy has a model, right, of maintaining open lanes of commerce and providing, you know, search and rescue, different things like that, where I think that that's going to be fairly akin to what you're going to see the Space Force and Space Forces do as we go forward. So when we're looking at this, you know, there's a lot of complexities out there, because there's a massive amount of treaty-based organizations, right? And a lot of people will hear, oh, hey, you're trying to create another one? That's awesome. There's like 10 million already. So, you know, why this? Why now? Why should we do this, right? And that's a in my view, I think it's an easier question to answer. Some would say that it's fairly difficult because you're advocating for something that's most likely going to spend billions and billions of dollars of taxpayer money. Nevertheless, when you put it into context, obviously space is central to all of our lives. Most everybody on this call probably already knows that. And so, as you know, you rely on space every moment, right? We are relying on space right now for us to have this conversation. And so, because of that, I think that it does beg for a system that can maintain security in that domain and maintain this level of standard of living that we are having right now across the alliance. And so, in the past, you've seen other treaties passed and established that handle different things similarly to what I just said, but more so dealing with what was going on at the time, right? You have the North Atlantic Treaty, which clearly dealt with security in the North Atlantic region and established NATO. It was 1949. The Outer Space Treaty, of course, 1967, didn't establish any treaty-based system or a treaty-based organization, but did establish the first full swath of norms that we, as international states, had agreed to. Then you have the Southeast Asia Collective Defense Treaty, which was essentially a copy of NATO, but for the Southeast Asian region, particularly during the Vietnam War. That was passed in 1954. It no longer exists. So it was actually deemed to be fairly ineffective at its tasks that it was given, and was not renewed or continued as time went on. I can't remember exactly when it was shut down, but I'm pretty sure it was around it was in the early 70s. And I apologize, my cat. Nice. And so we have the Convention of the European Space Agency, and that is very clear what in its title, right, established the ESA, which is separate from the European Union. That's a common confusion that a lot of people do have when they see it. They think that ESA is actually just the EU's space agency. That's not actually the case. Then we have the Convention of the Asia Pacific Space Cooperation Organization. So this one's also interesting. This is another international treaty-based system that the Chinese have actually developed. This was established in particularly I think it was like 2007, to garner a lot of states in the Asia Pacific region into China's sphere of influence in both scientific and civil space activity. But when you really look deep into Chinese space activity, nothing's really fully civil. A lot of it's still very intensely tied to the military. So, I'm sorry, that was 2005 right there. And then the Artemis Accords in 2020. And so you see these organizational frameworks that I'm going to be looking at. You have NATO, ESA, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, the ILRSO, as we've mentioned earlier, and the APSCO that I just mentioned. A few theories that are going to be applied. The revolution in military affairs, so that's positing organizational change and technological transformation actually can lead to a strategic upper hand, both in military conflict, but also just in a grand strategy level. Then you have scientific revolutions and paradigm shifts. So given that what's happening with technology in the space industry today, we're seeing this kind of paradigm shift and the scientific revolution take place. If you look over the last 20 years, you've seen a lot of innovation take place in the sector, and so with that, you're seeing so many changes happening. Right, we've gone from not even that long ago having a reusable rocket was thought as preposterous. Now to the industry standard is if you see a rocket blow up, or if you see a rocket actually just fall back to Earth and hit the ocean, apparently it is it's a failure, right? Which is really funny because that is actually how we've dealt with rockets for decades. But now that has been so ingrained within the populace that if we see that, we actually think failure, right? So you're seeing these step-by-step innovations that are becoming normalized and becoming the standard, and leading to a complete paradigm shift from where you didn't have much access to space. Now we're talking, you could potentially have hundreds of tons on just one launch, get into orbit. So that's what I mean by that. And then you have classical liberal IR theory. That's a unique one because generally people will take IR theories, and this is international relations theory. Generally people will take, a liberal institutionalist or internationalist perspective or a realist perspective. And I wanted to change it up because I've done a lot of reading in the field of international relations theory. And I actually discovered that there's been some recent scholarship that actually has brought to light some of the classical liberal scholars long ago and their perspectives on international relations, which I will say are slightly different from liberal and realism. They might lean a little bit closer towards realism, but they have a little bit more nuance, and they're a little bit more accepting of international cooperation, multilateral cooperation, much to actually my surprise at the time when I was reading it. So I decided to take some of that IR theory and put it in here because I think it fit the conversation and the topic pretty well. And so we don't need to go too much into this. I've kind of already talked a little bit about it, right? You see Starship there. That's obviously the scientific revolution that I'm talking about. And then that's the preamble from the ESA convention. So here I do go into this because this does lend credence as to why this research is taking place and what is this grand strategy and geopolitical competition we're seeing on Earth and in space. And as you can see here from Yi Paishan, who's the director of the Chinese Lunar Exploration Program, or he was. I think there is actually someone who's taken his place recently. He comments the universe, and you might have already seen this, but he comments that the universe is an ocean, the moon is the Diu Island, Mars is the Huangyang Island. If we don't go, when we can go now, then future generations will blame us. If others go, then they will take over, and you won't be able to go even if you wanted to. This is reason enough, right? So obviously, making a claim of Mars and the moon being literally, non-Chinese territories that China has been very, very antagonistic towards, it does raise cause for concern, right? A lot of people have quoted this quote, cited this quote. A lot of people have used it, and of course, I thought it was kind of funny with the image here, with the red kind of emanating from behind him. That was his official portrait, so I thought, well, I mean, I'll put that here. He has published a lot. Actually, he's very well published, very innovative, and a very intelligent man. Has been very critical to the lunar exploration program's successes over a short period of time. And what I mean by those successes is just their development of the various subsystems and systems that they want to put in place for lunar exploration for that 2030 date that a lot of them have, a lot of strategists have cited. And so, when you look at that, it does beg the question of, okay, if China is establishing multiple international organizations, what is the U.S. and what are the U.S. and her allies doing as well? And their systems, China's international organizations, are quite different. They are legally binding. They do require, personnel input and potentially financial input based on what we've heard so far. So if that's the case, the Artemis Accords, while they do establish some very soft norms, they don't require those things. And if the United States does want to get to that next level of multilateral cooperation in the domain, it might have to require some kind of buy-in, right? We've seen a very effective institution have this, and that's NATO. And so that's why I do cite NATO a lot. Now, I do get caught up, right, with a lot of, some people will get a little confused and say, well, are you talking about a military treaty-based system, or are you talking about a civil space treaty-based system? And I do tell them most of the time is that Well, I mean, it can kind of be both, right? It doesn't necessarily need to be NATO in the sense of, large standing forces and a force structure that can be activated, during under Article 5 or other, security situations. But it can have some kind of security apparatus within it, right? Ignoring the security element of exploration and development is naive. The fact remains that you are going to have some kind of security element as you explore and develop the domain. And what I mean by that is the entire Chinese program is military, right? So any astronaut that does go up there, or taikonaut technically, that goes into space is reporting directly to the Equipment Development Division of the Central Military Commission, right? So they all work for the China Manned Space Agency, and that's who that reports to. So that's a hierarchy. At the end of the day, it is a military program. Everything they launch is technically military. Anything that they place on the moon, currently under their structures that they've developed, is military. So given that fact, and given the likelihood that we're not going to have a lot of American astronauts walking in and out of their of a Chinese base consistently to make sure that it adheres to the Outer Space Treaty's requirements that you do not place military bases or conduct military maneuvers, both of which we have not fully defined, creates this conundrum, right? And so having at least an apparatus internationally that both establishes those norms, but also can enforce them, right? Just like we see with the Navy on the high seas. And I think a really good example of that is currently, we're seeing a lot of activity with the Houthis and a lot of naval forces, not just our own, right? Because of a lot of our systems in place, we've been able to cooperate in those regions to repel attacks like that. Now, do I think we're going to see similar, attacks in the coming, decades? Probably not. But nevertheless, having that apparatus in place and already being proactive rather than reactive to a situation is what a lot of people who have informed this research has led us to. So real quick, I'm going to go through the methodology and methods. This is pretty quick and simple. So I'm doing text-based analysis, looking through all the various treaties that you can think of that I highlighted earlier, and organizational frameworks as well. So how exactly do these treaty-based organizations operate? What are their legal structures? Who's in charge? How do they have? What are their committees? What are their councils? How exactly are they managed? And various things like that. So I'm doing textual analysis, which is essentially going through these documents, coding them in an audit trail, and finding those similar pieces or key themes that are matching between the treaties, and seeing what has generally been accepted as what works best. Then I'm doing a Delphi method, and this is, I think, the more exciting portion of this research, but certainly the most intense and time-consuming. And the Delphi method is essentially taking a bunch of experts in the field and interviewing them, but blindly interviewing them. So they don't know who else is being interviewed, and they don't know what those interviewees' answers are. And I'm collecting all that information, finding the key points where most people are agreeing or providing, good insight, and then doing another round and another round. And so through those 3 rounds of interviews, we should be able to get to a general understanding of, even if people disagree with each other in public, what are they agreeing with each other in private on, and they don't even know it, right? And so then you can find a real good baseline. What would a treaty-based organization look like if it is established that kind of goes that next level from the Artemis Accords? Might not be as broad in terms of who joins, but what does that look like, right? And we should be able to get a general understanding, even if some of these people would say, oh, well, I actually don't think we need it right now. That's not the questions, right? The questions are, what should it look like? And that's where we are able to bypass a lot of the biases that people have that might originally, when interviewing somebody, they might just go on a tangent and say, no, we don't need something. It's like, well, that's not the question, right? So that's what I really like about the Delphi method. It was developed by the Rand Corporation, I think back in the 60s, and has been actually fairly praised in many studies because of the ability to get consensus between a lot of people that without this kind of blindfold, right, on it would probably not reach any kind of consensus on anything. Then we'll have international jurisprudence. So that's just a study of nature of law internationally. I am not a lawyer. I have taken multiple space law classes, and so I've dipped my toes into that field. But we are going to be looking at how have treaties been developed through legal means, not necessarily the geopolitical realities, and also what has previous international law set that is going to inform directly, what something like this is going to look like, how it's going to be accepted and whatnot. So that's kind of those methods and methodology that we're doing here. The expectation is that we're probably going to reach the end of this research around December to January this next upcoming year, and then we will go into the finalizing of all the writing for it, and hopefully publish that in May 2025, as well as defend. And so some of the expected results, which I accept, and I also acknowledge some of my biases in this, but that's why I'm also doing things like the Delphi method to understand, where am I, trying to make sure that I do not validate my biases, but also hear, and get that information from those who probably disagree with me on some of my expectations. Nevertheless, I do think that we're going to find that a lot of people do agree that there needs to be some kind of formalizing going on here with cooperation across like-minded states for a multitude of reasons. That's to maintain security, so maintaining, the fact that we have not seen, conflict break out in space, as particularly kinetic conflict between states in space. And promote the exploration and development of space. So, and potentially actually decrease barriers to those for member states, right? I think that we're going to find that the most effective frameworks are NATO and ESA. Reason being is because I think that the economic buy-in to those has lended to their successes. And what I mean by successes is that they are a functioning, right, organization. They have a management, they have projects and programs that they complete and conduct. And so they're a perpetuating organization. Now, yes, of course, they receive a lot of funding, but at the end of the day, they have effectiveness levels. And to kind of contrast that, I would argue that ASPCO, Asia South Pacific, I think so. Sorry, it's a very long, a lot of these are pretty long names, but the APSCO organization that China launched really has done hardly anything at all. They do throw some money at it, but it really doesn't actually have many programs or projects or staff, and arguably is not a very effective organization per what it was originally stood up to do. Now, of course, that might not be the reality of what they wanted to do, and hence why it's not very effective. But based on the original founding documents, it's clear that it wasn't very effective. And same thing with the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization that I mentioned earlier. And then the last two is a space treaty-like organization would probably be counter to China and Russia's ILRSO. I think that's becoming quite obvious that there's this breakup, right? And that the likelihood of having some kind of organization where China, Russia, and the United States are going to be a part of it is probably not realistic at this time. And so then a treaty-based organization would be more effective than the Accords due to the economic buy-in, as I mentioned earlier. Now, I do, just for fun, I do have a couple of things here on the side. And, you know, a lot of people, when they hear this, they'll say like, oh, well, are you talking like Starfleet? And I'll chuckle and I'll be like, sure, you know, for fun. But there actually has been, I do think what's really important is looking sometimes at science fiction, because science fiction has informed reality and vice versa quite a lot. And when you look at science fiction, there are many organizations that have been established in video games or movies or books that are very similar to what we're talking about here right now. Sometimes they are multilateral, sometimes they're entirely international. And right here we have two. We have one that you know, is very familiar with most of you probably, is Starfleet's United Federation of Planets, right? That is a very international system. Almost all the states have joined that organization and have contributed to it and actually made it, you know, a international government. Then you have this one that was it came out not that long ago. It was under Starfield, I think, was a video game. And this, I had read and seen that this was Constellation, I think, which was like an organization that kind of had quasi-security exploration initiatives. But that one was only multilateral, right? So there was apparently other factions in the video game that were kind of coming head to head a little bit with this organization, right? So you have seen things like this play out in science fiction, and it's always interesting to just note that, you know, sometimes science fiction authors do have some interesting insights into the future, but also just how humans interact with each other, and particularly as we extend into the outer space domain. But with that, I will leave it to questions and comments and discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, that was wonderful. And thank you so much, Eric, for those insights. I really, is your background, is that, that's animated? Oh, that's very cool too. Yeah, so as you'll find out, I think many folks in the audience are super sci-fi fans, as I am. So I think we'll probably have a lot to talk about. I'll start by asking a question from one of our audience members, Mr. Mark Meyer. And he's talking about, or at least he's asking a question with regard to how do we grow cooperation, you know, and you mentioned right at the very beginning, you kind of had this ILRSO and Artemis tension that seems to be going on. But he's asking, you know, should we start by implementing space law into sort of the national dialogue, and then have that sort of trickle up into kind of the supranational or domain as a way of sort of promoting best practice, but also promoting cooperation?
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I do think that it should probably start at the national level and then go into the supranational level. You know, growing cooperation in the domain. I'm of the viewpoint that I think that there is writing on the wall. I do not believe that we are going to be cooperating with China and Russia, as a lot of fanciful, even movies, right, in Hollywood have kind of shown in the domain. I just don't see it currently. I think that's a very human nature kind of thing. Others will say, no, it's in our human nature to, of course, cooperate and work together. And you know, I like to be optimistic. I'm very optimistic about the future, but I'm also, I try to be an optimistic realist in the sense of, you know, if the writing's on the wall, what does that mean we do? And I think that means that we need to take a big step back and look at ourselves and be like, okay, we need to probably stop trying to win over everybody, because it's one, we haven't, right? And I don't think we will. what we need to do is find who are our friends, right? And figure out what that is going to look like with them. And so having those very serious conversations, and I think we've already started that, right? I think the Artemis Accords was the beginning of that. And that's why in many ways, in cases that it was a good thing that it actually wasn't binding, because it just set the tone, right? It laid the foundation of going into that next level of, okay, who are the big ones in this? And then who are the ones that are kind of on the periphery that we're probably going to lose possibly? Or who are the ones that are just, they really want to be involved, but they don't want to get super involved in some kind of binding system, right? And so the Artemis Accords, I don't think will be entirely replaced, right, in that regard. But I do think, to your question, right, to really develop that cooperation out, there needs to be some kind of formal forum, right, where people are coming together and sitting down, not at the International Astronautical Congress, not at, Space Symposium. I'm talking a forum of states that sit down with each other, and not under the United Nations either, but also outside of NATO, that sit down with each other and really develop out, okay, what is this, right? Because when you look at the Artemis Accords from a legal perspective, it's really a bilateral thing, right? These are bilateral agreements between the United States and those other countries. It's not Japan signing on to the accords with, they're signing on at the same time with 20 other states, right? So while this was a good foundation, we need to get to that next level of bringing people in the room and saying, okay, here's the reality, right? What are we going to do about it, and where are we going to go with it? I think that's needed. But to your point with the national, the domestic side, we need to understand what is our grand strategy. We need to have that from a policy and strategy perspective at the highest echelons of our government to understand, okay, what's the 5, 10, 20, 50-year future we want, right? And let's present that also, to our allies and say, this is what we think. Are you in agreement? And then go from there, right? And I think most of them would be, but I think a lot of them are really looking towards us, the United States, in this manner of taking that direction and initiative. So yeah. Sorry for the long answer.
No, not at all. No, it creates other questions, which is really really great. No, I mean, just other things with regard to kind of the point. I'm gonna kind of draw back to some of the discussion that you had about Yi Pizhang, and to use Judge Baker's words, kind of that first mover advantage. That seems to be a motivator, at least for countries who are predominantly run, or at least their space program is run, via a military organization. And this is kind of a two-part question, I think. But what do you think as far as the impetus or the drive to be the first mover is relative to kind of the economic, the NATO ESA camp versus the Chinese, maybe Russian military-driven initiatives?
Yeah. So your question is like, which one has that first mover advantage, or?
Well, I'm sorry. No. What it more says is when it comes to the motivation of being the first mover, the person, the group of people who are the first ones there, do you think that kind of economically based partnerships are going to be driven more by that, or is it going to be more of the military camp, i.e. kind of our case study?
Well, sadly, I think it's going to be the military, because they are, in this sense, right, you have states such as China, particularly, that is in the largest military buildup in the history of our species. And I cannot stress that enough. I know most everybody on this call already knows that, but we really got to hit that home with people. I don't think people understand how big this military buildup technically is. Historically, you don't really build up a military that large for the intent to not use it. I've never really seen that happen. This could be the first case, but obviously human nature, in history has informed us differently. So I have expectations of what they're going to do, right? A lot of us do. But their military, the reason that I would actually say that that gives them, some advantages there is because they're when you have a military structure, you're given a task, you're given a mission set, right? And it's very clear cut. Okay, do this. You're not having to come up with a business model and create an economic pipeline and then get investors. If it's funded by the party and the state and they are given a task, they have a lot less hurdles that they have to get over from an economic and a political standpoint, right? Now, of course, you can go into, they have disadvantages because it's a military focused program. And I fully agree with that. I do actually like the fact that the West has taken the economic point and perspective, because that is the much more long-term, right, strength there. If that can get fully developed out and established, then the West will have a much higher advantage long-term. Now, that being said, if we're talking just, particularly like access to the lunar surface or cislunar or wherever we're talking about, the military aspect, I think you might see them do some things faster than we do. But that's just my perspective.
No, that's perfect, and it kind of leads into kind of another question I jotted down during your conversation, with regard to the international relations framework. Of course, I grew up in a big Morgenthau fan, and I know many on this call have read, excuse me, not watched, read Morgenthau's treatise. But you'd mentioned kind of this tension between, well, not maybe tension, but this relationship between movements in the international relations arena, from a liberal perspective to sort of this perhaps even neo-realistic perspective. And would be interested in what your research has revealed thus far with regard to that trend. Are we seeing the pendulum sort of swing in one direction or another?
Yeah, I definitely think that we're seeing it swing more towards the realism camp, away from the liberal internationalism, particularly because liberal internationalism largely does have, this view that you're going to have, that you can maintain rules-based, a rules-based order. We hear that all the I've heard that almost beaten out of me. I've heard that so much that it's gotten a little old. But when I say that is that I personally come from the perspective that there never really was a rules-based international order. There just wasn't a violation of what we thought there was a rules-based international order of. And that's why I actually think that the liberal internationalism camp, where it gets it wrong, and when I was doing a lot of research into, I had always found myself obviously being a little bit more on the realist side, as you can probably imagine from this discussion. But I had some pretty big qualms with a handful of the realists, right? Realists are not just they don't just quickly support multilateral cooperation, right? Realism obviously is founded in that the state's interest is in itself first, and I do agree with that. But very frequently they become pretty skeptical of multilateral systems or treaty-based organizations, particularly because they think that it can take the sovereignty away from the state, and that's where I slightly disagree with them. I don't think that any state joins willingly a multilateral organization to have its sovereignty taken away from it, right? I think it actually joins that system for its own self-interest. And while all these self-interested states actually are like, well, we're interested in preserving ourselves, but we're going to band together so we can all preserve ourselves. But I'm not really banding into this organization so you can preserve yourself. It's just you have strength that you can offer me, and I have strength that I might be able to offer you. And it's a means to an end, right? In some ways, that's a very, I don't want to say depressing way to look at it, right? But it doesn't sound as fanciful as everybody just getting along, right? Nevertheless, I think what I found when I was reading a lot of this classical liberal IR theory recently by a man by the name of Edwin van der Haar, he's a Dutch IR theorist, very brilliant guy. Really what it was that, you know, like-minded states, while they are obviously trying to preserve their self-interest first and foremost, they recognize that other like-minded states, obviously, hence the phrase, share their same values and serve as essentially another shield, right, of those values. And so cooperating, right, on strategic areas is extremely important. And so you need to leave those lanes of cooperation open, because if you just ignore, right, and he uses, of course, World War II as a perfect example of this. A lot of the like-minded states started falling, right, from the Nazi expansion. And because of that, right, we were attacked, right, in the Pacific, but at the end of the day, we also realized, and there's a bunch of FDR speeches on this, that we realize that if we don't, you know, do anything in Europe, it's just gonna be us, right, against the world, and that there's nothing that doesn't do anything for us, and it also loses all these other countries that have fairly similar views, right, in terms of democracy and republics and whatnot. So that's kind of the model to follow there. And that's what I think is, while we are swinging to a more realism focused, you know, foreign policy perspective, I would hope to not lose that. And you can see it in some of the rhetoric, right, with some people, is that I don't want to lose that sense that we do need to cooperate multilaterally with like-minded states. If we don't, then we will be at a weaker point and a weaker posture in the world. And while I do understand, you know, the need to focus on, you know, our state first, which is absolutely needed, there is also that priority that you have to cooperate with others to actually put yourself first in a way. It's kind of odd situation there, but that's really what classical liberal IR theory kind of gets into. And so I think that it's a really good model to follow that it's certainly on the more realist camp, but it kind of softens the blow of the pendulum swinging too hard, right, to that side. So hopefully that gave you a good answer there.
No, absolutely, and I know that we're at the last 4 minutes here, but some of our audience members are very expert folks in the ethics realm, and so I did want to kind of ask some of your perspectives that your research has maybe revealed with regard to the driver that ethics has, you know, kind of the, you know, especially, I think this is always a great place to talk about it in the space domain, because there's just not a whole lot of law, you know, like thou shalt not, you know, okay, well, don't put W&Ds in space. Well, okay, that makes a lot of sense. But what other type of ethical drivers do you see out there that are motivators to states cooperating in this domain?
Yeah, well, I think this kind of goes into a little bit of the work that I'm doing with my company. That you know, I would love to obviously get more into that topic, and right, dealing with resources. You know, that we could spend a whole day on that, right? But it kind of lends into that, right? So you have the issue of private companies, right? And the United States has made it very clear that we're all for private companies going out there and doing what, you know, what they want to do, and being able to, you know, extract resources and sell them, right? That's very clear, and it's backed up by a handful of states. Now, it's not obviously the international norm, but it's backed up by the domestic laws that are the most important, right, for those companies to do those activities. And so when you see that, I think there's a lot actually on the ethics side that comes into this, because particularly in the United States, with private companies going out and you know, innovating and potentially taking that leap into that realm to, you know, collect data or extract resources, there's a lot of concern, right, about the perspectives that are held by other states, such as China, on this topic, right? They've been a little bit antagonistic when it comes to this. And so there are concerns, of course, when it, when you're talking about, okay, well, if you're extracting, like what is ethical, and then also what is ethical behavior, right, in these domains, safety zones, right? And that was a big discussion at the SpaceCom legal conference, right, about the safety zones. What the legal precedents for that, right? The Outer Space Treaty. There's a lot of, is it okay? But I think you get down into the reality of the situation, and you understand that, these companies, we've given them a right to do these operations, and so they have a right to the safety of those operations. They have a right to the ability to, peacefully and securely conduct these operations for their own economic benefit, right? And that lends a lot of, there's these questions of, we think that's ethical, right? And the Chinese are coming in saying, no, it's not, right? And so there's these different views on ethics, right? Now, I think that some of those are actually informed by ethics, and some of them are informed by geopolitical posturing. Nevertheless, using ethics as a shield, right? But I definitely think that we need to look at space, and particularly the commercial expansion into the domain, and especially cislunar, with an ethical lens of, how are we going to do this, that in a way that allows the free enterprise to operate and operate securely, but is also still adhering to a lot of those norms that we've already agreed to, right, within the Outer Space Treaty. And the problem is as human presence escalates, it's going to become harder, right, to operate within a lot of these structures that we've established, just due to how humans interact, right? And that doesn't even go for states. That's just something that we see even here on Earth. But I know we're at the top of the hour, so I don't want to take up too much time. I would love to continue the conversation, but.
Well, absolutely. We do have one small one, if people are willing to stay just a shade over. Dr. Kendall from Swinburne University, thanks for joining us. I think I'm not sure if this had already been answered, but I'll ask it just anyhow, just to make sure that we close the loop. She asked, do you feel it will harm other cooperation in space if those international norms, or if that international norm specifically, is challenged? And so we would close on that.
Yeah, so, sorry, I see that there. There we go. I can read it. Yeah, so do I believe that it would harm other cooperation in space if that international norm is challenged? And that international norm, are we talking, which norm exactly are we talking about? She might be able to.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. I can, let's see. Let's see.
Oh, there we go. Hold up.
Okay.
Commercial interests.
Yes.
There we go. Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, if commercial interests, are, so if commercial interests are challenged, I think that we're going to see, or if you're saying that, if commercial interests come in and actually impact the international norm, I think that, it depends, right? Like everything, you always hear it depends. I think it would depend only in the sense of, right, which sides are you generally on, right? There's very clear, promotion of commercial interests and protection of commercial interests within a lot of states that you could consider like-minded, right? On the United States side, right? So if you look at a lot of European states, if you look at Japan, right, Australia, you're seeing a lot of discussion and a path going towards really backing the commercial sector. So, the interpretation, right, of those norms on both sides is, I think you're starting to see, these interpretations of, oh, well, I mean, the Outer Space Treaty doesn't say we can't do this, we can do this. These commercial, companies can come in and do these activities. Whereas the Chinese might take a different stance to that. for a multitude of reasons, right? They might not actually be founded deeply in legal understandings. It might actually be more so posturing, because they are a unique country, right? Their companies aren't necessarily entirely private, right? They generally have a lot of oversight by the party and the government. So I think you have, right, you're going to have two warring beliefs there as commercial interests, start to expand. That being said, I think that there would still be two very strong arguments to be made on both sides, for and against it. And they would be able to actually back up, I'm sure they'd be able to back up their points very easily, that, it's not actually challenging too much the international norms, whereas the other side might say that it is. So I think that, and then that goes back into the reality, right? That goes a little bit away from the law side into the IR side, which is what that research kind of was going into, is that, you may have those two different viewpoints of the legal side of the house, but they're still going to battle each other, right? The geopolitical reality is that they're probably not going to come together and agree fully. And so how do you handle that fact that you might have states that just completely disagree with each other? And I think that handling it through, blocks, while I don't like having to create blocks, it might be able to balance it better than having a lot of disparate parts. So, but I mean, I obviously, I know we're already 5 over. I would love to continue the discussion. So, Aubrey, I don't know if you want me to put my email in the chat, or if you want to share. I am more than happy to answer questions or even just have discussions. Right, that's the whole point of what we do in our scholarly work, is to move the ball forward, have those discussions, and I get my mind changed all the time. Not too much, but enough to keep it interesting. So,
well, absolutely, and I've dropped your email in the chat just preemptively. When she said it was all right, I went and did that, and I'm sure you'll probably have several follow-ups on this very, very interesting discussion. And want to thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your thesis. And I can tell you from USAFA's perspective, we wish you the very best of luck in your defense, every success, because I can already tell this is going to be a very groundbreaking level of research. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and perspectives today, Eric.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for having me and coming out and giving your questions and just your attention this morning.
Thank you. So long.
Thank you.